It took Marcus Thorne exactly 12 seconds to undo a decade of my life's work. He did it with a dismissive wave of his hand and a tap on a 60-inch touchscreen. 12 seconds. One for each month of the year I'd spent meticulously building the trace contaminant protocol for TerraCorp engineering. A protocol that had become the industry gold standard, a shield of scientific integrity that protected not just our company's reputation, but entire communities from invisible poisons lurking in their soil and water. My name is Dr. Anya Sharma. For 10 years, I have been the head of environmental impact assessment here. It's not a glamorous title. It doesn't come with stock options that vest quarterly or a corner office with a panoramic view of the city. My office is a lab filled with the scent of sterilized glass and ozone from the mass spectrometer. My work is in the dirt, the water, the air. I am a hunter of chemical ghosts, the silent, toxic legacies of progress. My reports, dense with data and cross-referenced analysis, are the only thing standing between a billion-dollar construction project and a town's drinking water. They were the bedrock of this company, or they were until Marcus arrived. The battlefield he chose was the main boardroom, a sterile glass box on the 40th floor designed to make you feel both powerful and exposed. The air was thick with the smell of expensive coffee, and a tension so palpable you could taste the metal in it. At the head of the long mahogany table stood Marcus Thorne, our new vice president of business development, recruited 6 months ago from some soulless private equity firm on the East Coast. He looked less like an engineer and more like a predator poured into a bespoke Italian suit. His silver laptop gleamed under the recessed lighting like a freshly forged weapon. My weapon, by contrast, seemed ancient. A 3-inch thick binder, 80 pages of hard data, geological surveys, and groundwater flow charts. The Nightingale Project. It was a proposed chemical processing plant to be built on a tract of land bordering a small agricultural town in the valley. A town that relied on its wells. My team and I had spent the last 3 weeks on site. We drilled core samples until our arms ached. We tested the aquifer at a dozen different depths. We analyzed the runoff patterns from the winter rains. The data was not ambiguous. It was not open to interpretation. It was a klaxon horn, a flashing red light. The groundwater beneath the proposed site showed abnormally high concentrations of naturally occurring arsenic. Building a massive chemical plant on top of it, with the inherent risk of industrial leakage and soil disturbance, was like playing Russian roulette with a gun pointed at the heart of a sleeping town. "Thank you, Anya, for that thorough presentation," Marcus began, his voice as smooth and polished as the table between us. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the giant touchscreen that dominated the wall, a canvas for his masterpiece of deception, the Geosynth AI. But at TerraCorp, we are moving past the era of manual analysis and, frankly, outdated fearmongering. Fearmongering. The word was a slap. It hung in the air, a deliberate and public assault on my scientific integrity. I felt the eyes of the other executives on me, Julian Caldwell, the CEO, Margaret from legal, the heads of operations and finance. I kept my expression a perfect, neutral mask. My hands rested calmly on my binder. Inside, my stomach was a knot of ice. I had presented the facts, clear and undeniable. He was reframing them as hysteria. Geosynth, he continued, gesturing to the screen with a theatrical flourish, allows us to streamline our risk assessment. It aggregates millions of data points, standardizes outliers, and provides us with clear, actionable insights in a fraction of the time. It is the end of ambiguity. He tapped the screen. My complex, detailed charts appeared. The spiky red peaks that showed the arsenic hotspots were like a mountain range on the display, a clear warning. "As you can see," he said, addressing the room as if I were a ghost he couldn't see, "Dr. Sharma's data shows several concerning anomalies." He paused, letting the weight of the word anomalies sink in, as if they were inconvenient glitches rather than lethal threats. Or, as the AI correctly identifies them, they are statistical outliers. They fall outside the 99% confidence interval of the regional geological profile. In other words, they are noise. With another tap, a dialog box appeared on the screen. "Normalized data set?" it asked. And just like that, with a single, arrogant motion, he erased a decade of my work and a lifetime of scientific principle. He hit confirm. My red peaks, my warnings, my certainty, all of it vanished. The jagged mountain range of data was flattened into a gentle, harmless, rolling green line. The screen now showed a perfect site, a clean site, a safe site, a beautiful, murderous lie. This, Marcus declared, turning to the room with a smile that radiated a sociopathic level of confidence, is the future. Clean data, fast decisions, and unparalleled growth. The Nightingale Project is a green light. He looked directly at me then, a clear challenge in his dark eyes. He expected me to argue, to protest, to become emotional and make a scene, thereby proving his point that I was an old-fashioned scientist, not a forward-thinking executive. He was profoundly mistaken. I learned long ago, in academia and in this boardroom, that the person who raises their voice is the person who loses the argument. I would not give him the satisfaction. I simply gave him a small, tight nod, a gesture of submission that I knew must have tasted like the sweetest victory to him. As he launched into a slick presentation about how Geosynth would triple our project approval rate and revolutionize shareholder value, I slipped my phone under the polished surface of the table. My fingers were perfectly steady. There was no tremor, no hesitation. A cold, clear purpose was crystallizing in my veins. I opened my personal, encrypted cloud storage service, an app he wouldn't know existed, protected by a level of security he couldn't comprehend. I created a new folder. I typed one word as its name, Nightingale. That was the moment my resignation from TerraCorp became an inevitability, but I wasn't going to just walk away and let him poison an entire town. I had built the very protocols that protected this company and the communities it served. Marcus Thorne, in his infinite arrogance, had turned my shield into a weapon of reckless endangerment. He thought he had erased my work in 12 seconds. He had no idea he had just signed his own professional death warrant. He wanted a digital revolution. I was going to give him one, a revolution built on a foundation of documented, preserved, undeniable truth. My revenge wouldn't be loud or emotional. It would be quiet, meticulous, and absolute. It would be a paper trail so damning it would burn his entire gilded empire to the ground. The memo arrived the next day. It was sent from Marcus's office to all department heads, CCing the CEO. Effective immediately, all environmental impact assessments were to be processed exclusively through the Geosynth AI platform. The language was cold, corporate, and absolute. All raw field data, it instructed, was to be uploaded directly to the AI, which would then generate the final, client-facing summary. The final sentence was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive threat. To improve workflow efficiency and maintain a consistent data narrative, the submission of ancillary manual analyses will be discontinued. It was a gag order disguised as a policy update. He was severing my official channel to report the truth. He was creating a closed loop, a black box where he was the only one with the key. Data went in, his desired result came out. No questions, no dissent. He thought he was building a fortress. In reality, he was building his own prison, and I was going to be the one who documented its construction, brick by fraudulent brick. The Nightingale dossier was no longer just a folder. It was my full-time, clandestine job. The first few weeks were a study in corporate gaslighting. The executive floor buzzed with the new energy Marcus had injected. He was a deal maker, a rainmaker, a miracle worker. He was landing contracts that had been stalled for years in regulatory review, all thanks to the speed and certainty of Geosynth. The system was hailed as a triumph of innovation. In this new narrative, I was cast as the villain, the relic who stood in the way of progress. Colleagues who used to stop me in the hall to discuss soil composition now offered tight, uncomfortable smiles and avoided my gaze in the elevator. My team, the scientists and engineers who did the actual work, were feeling the pressure from both ends. They were being squeezed by Marcus's impossible deadlines and demoralized by a system that treated their expertise as an inconvenience. The first piece of concrete evidence for my dossier came from Leo Petrichelli, a brilliant field geologist with 40 years of experience and hands as weathered as the rock formations he studied. He came to my lab after hours, long after the executives had gone home. He looked defeated. He was holding a company-issued tablet, its screen glowing with the clean, user-friendly interface of the Geosynth Field app. "Anya, look at this," he said, his voice a low, frustrated rumble. He showed me the data entry page for the new Redwood Bridge project. It was a massive infrastructure project, and my original assessments had flagged that it involved sinking massive pylons into a seismic liquefaction zone. It was delicate, dangerous work that depended entirely on accurate soil analysis. I took 3 core samples from the riverbank this afternoon. They all show a high saturation of silt and unstable clay. The kind of stuff that turns to soup in an earthquake. But every time I enter the actual shear strength values, the system flags it. It calls it a device calibration error. What does it tell you to do? I asked, my voice calm, even as a cold anger settled deep in my chest. This was it, the machine's bias in action. It gives me two options, he said, his disgust palpable. Recalibrate and retest, which we don't have time for under the new deadlines. Or, he tapped the screen. The second option appeared. Accept regional average. Accept regional average. A beautifully sterile, scientifically illiterate phrase for ignore the specific, life-threatening danger right in front of you. What did you do, Leo? He looked down at his worn leather boots, unable to meet my eyes. Marcus's new project manager, that kid fresh out of business school, was breathing down my neck. He told me to just accept the average so we could move on to the next site. Said we couldn't let one finicky sensor hold up $100 million project. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. Leo, I need you to do something for me, something off the record. I need you to keep your old field notebook, the paper one. I want you to write down every single real measurement you take, date it, time it. And every single time the system forces you to accept an average, I want you to take a screenshot on that tablet before you hit accept. He looked up, a flicker of his old, defiant spirit returning to his tired eyes. What are you doing, Anya? I'm doing my job, Leo, I said, meeting his gaze. I'm preserving the data, the real data. He didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded, a silent pact passing between us. He left my lab looking a little less defeated. That night, I created the first subfolder inside the Nightingale dossier. I named it Redwood Bridge. I started a new encrypted spreadsheet, my incident log, the heart of my case. I made the first entry date. Project name. Issue: Geosynth AI systematically rejects valid geotechnical data indicating soil instability in a seismic liquefaction zone. Person involved: Leo Petrocelli. Action taken: project manager override accepted false data under duress. Potential impact: catastrophic structural failure during seismic event. It was just a few lines of text in a spreadsheet, but it felt as solid and heavy as concrete. It was the first stone laid in the foundation of a courthouse. Or a tomb. The next incident came a week later, solidifying the pattern. The Pine Crest residential development. A massive new subdivision being built alarmingly close to an old, decommissioned industrial site that had never been properly remediated. My team's preliminary air quality tests from the perimeter showed intermittent spikes in PM2.5 particulate matter, the fine, invisible soot that lodges deep in the lungs and can cause a host of diseases, especially in children. The source was likely contaminated dust being kicked up by the initial excavation and grading work. Standard procedure would be to halt work immediately, implement extensive dust control measures like water spraying, and continuously monitor the air until it was safe. But the Pine Crest report, as generated by Geosynth AI, was pristine. A picture of clean, breathable air. I pulled the raw data logs from the server's temporary cache before they could be permanently archived and overwritten. I found the truth in seconds. The AI's algorithm had been programmed to recognize these spikes as anomalous atmospheric events, like a sudden gust of wind, and to simply drop those entire days of high readings from its final time weighted average. It was the digital equivalent of seeing a tumor on an X-ray and deciding to just delete that part of the image before showing it to the patient. Marcus approved the report without a second glance. The project moved forward at full speed. Hundreds of families would one day move into beautiful new homes where the very air their children breathed could be making them sick. I took a full, time-stamped copy of the raw data stream. I downloaded the falsified geosynthesis report. I took screenshots of Marcus's digital signature on the approval form, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night. Another subfolder was created. Another entry in my log. I was living two lives. By day, I was the compliant, slightly obsolete department head, quietly managing my team, answering emails, and submitting my data to the machine as required. By night, I became a digital ghost, a silent prosecutor moving through the company's servers, building a case. My personal cloud storage grew, file by file, screenshot by screenshot, log by damning log. Each file was a brick in the wall I was building around Marcus Thorne. He was so busy celebrating his quick victories, so high on the praise from the CEO and the board, that he never once thought to look over his shoulder. He thought he was the only one in the company smart enough to manipulate the system. He didn't realize I was the one keeping the score. The breaking point, The moment I knew I had to stop collecting evidence and start planning my endgame came 3 weeks after that first fateful boardroom meeting. It came with a sense of grim irony from the Nightingale project itself. Despite Marcus's triumphant green light, certain preliminary permits still required review by state agencies before any ground could be broken. A junior analyst in our regulatory department, a young woman named Chloe who was fresh out of grad school and still possessed a dangerous belief in doing things by the book, sent me an email. It was flagged as low priority, a simple technical question. Subject, question Ray, Nightingale Aquifer Modeling. Her email was straightforward. The state's water board required a predictive model showing the potential plume of contamination in a worst-case scenario industrial leak. Geosynth, of course, had produced a model. It was a neat little 3D animation showing any potential leak being safely contained within a deep layer of impermeable bedrock, spreading no more than a few yards. It was a comforting, beautiful fiction. But Chloe, to her immense credit, had noticed something odd. The AI's model used a hydraulic conductivity value for the topsoil that seemed exceptionally low. She was just asking if I could double-check it against my original field data for her own peace of mind. My blood ran cold. It was a feeling like stepping on a patch of ice you didn't see. Hydraulic conductivity is a simple measure of how easily water moves through soil. A low value means slow movement, like thick, dense clay. A high value means fast movement, like porous sand or gravel. It is one of the most critical variables in predicting the spread of contamination. Getting it wrong doesn't just skew the results, it invalidates them completely. I pulled up my original survey data, the files I had safely stored in my personal cloud. My team had measured the conductivity at multiple test sites. The value was consistent, 10 to the minus 3 centimeters per second. It was porous, silty soil. Dangerous. The kind of soil that would drink up a chemical spill and carry it straight into the aquifer. Then, I navigated into the developer logs for the Geosynth platform. It was a messy, complex backend that I was sure Marcus had never bothered to understand, but I had spent weeks mapping it out. I searched for the Nightingale project parameters, and there it was, a single line of code in the modeling module. The hydraulic conductivity value the AI had been instructed to use for its simulation was 10 to the minus 8 centimeters per second. That wasn't just optimistic. It was a scientific impossibility. It was the value for solid granite. He was telling the state that the topsoil of an agricultural valley had the same permeability as a mountain. It was the difference between a spill spreading a few feet over the course of a year and it contaminating the entire town's water supply in a matter of days. But the most damning part, the piece of evidence that elevated this from gross negligence to calculated criminal fraud, was the change log. The parameter had been manually overridden. The log showed the exact user ID and the timestamp. Marcus Thorne, 2 days after our meeting, at 2:37 a.m. from his home IP address. He hadn't just relied on the AI to smooth over the data. He had actively, deliberately, reached into the machine's brain and planted a fundamental lie at its very core to guarantee the result he wanted. This was the smoking gun, a premeditated, demonstrable act of fraud that put thousands of lives at risk. I saved a full copy of the log. I saved Chloe's email and my carefully worded reply confirming the massive discrepancy. I saved a copy of the falsified model animation he had submitted to the state. The Nightingale folder was now thick with irrefutable proof of a felony. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my darkened living room, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating a path forward. The weight of what I knew was a physical presence in the room. This wasn't about my job or my professional pride anymore. This was about the people of that valley who were sleeping soundly, trusting TerraCorp to protect them. They had no idea that their fate was being decided by a fraudulent algorithm and a man who saw their safety as an obstacle to his next bonus. I had the evidence. I had more than enough to destroy Marcus. But I realized that simply taking it to the CEO, Julian Caldwell, wasn't enough. Julian was a pragmatist, a businessman. He was currently enamored with Marcus and the fire hose of profits he was spraying over the company's bottom line. Faced with a scandal, Julian's first instinct would be to contain it. He might fire Marcus, bury the report, and fix the data quietly. A corporate slap on the wrist, that wasn't justice. That wouldn't undo the risks that had already been approved, like the ticking time bomb of the Redwood Bridge or the poisoned air at Pine Crest. No, the truth had to come out in a way that couldn't be buried. It had to explode in a forum so public and so official that the company would be forced to not only clean house, but to fundamentally and painfully change its new, corrupt culture. My plan had to evolve. It was no longer enough to just document Marcus's crimes. I had to create a situation where those crimes would be revealed on a stage of my own choosing. The plan began to form in my mind, a multi-step sequence as precise as a chemical titration. It started with a phone call I would make the next morning from a payphone downtown. A call to a friend from graduate school who now worked in the enforcement division of the Environmental Protection Agency. It would be an anonymous tip. I wouldn't give my name. Just a few key phrases about data integrity issues at a major national engineering firm and a few specific project names to get them started. Enough to put TerraCorp on their radar. Enough to start the slow, grinding clock on a potential federal investigation. The second part of the plan was more dangerous. I had to let Marcus overplay his hand one last time. I had to bait a trap. I needed one more piece of evidence, something so outrageously fraudulent, so brazen, that it would be impossible for anyone in the company, not even Julian, to ignore. The opportunity, I suspected, would come soon. A new, massive international project was on the horizon, the port's sovereign deep water harbor. It would be the biggest contract in TerraCorp's history. It would require compliance with strict European environmental regulations. And I knew Marcus would be right in the middle of it, hungry, reckless, and ready to cut any corner necessary to close the deal and claim his victory. I would be ready too, watching his every digital move, waiting for him to make his final, fatal mistake. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for the wolf to confidently step right into it. The pressure from human resources came, as I expected, in the form of a summons to a coaching session. The term itself was a masterpiece of corporate newspeak, a benign label for what was essentially a warning shot across the bow. The meeting was with Lisa, the head of HR, a woman who spoke exclusively in sanitized corporate jargon, and Marcus himself. He sat beside her, radiating a predatory calm, there to observe, to be the benevolent leader concerned about a struggling team member who just couldn't get with the new program. Lisa slid a document across the polished table, a performance improvement plan. It was filled with vague, unprovable accusations, each one a carefully chosen buzzword. Resistant to innovation. Failing to embrace a collaborative, forward-thinking mindset. Creating a siloed environment that hinders cross-departmental synergy. It was complete nonsense, but it was documented nonsense. This was HR 101, the first official step in building a paper trail to fire me for cause, protecting the company from a wrongful termination lawsuit. "Anya," Lisa said, her voice dripping with a synthetic concern that made my skin crawl, "we just want to make sure you have the support you need to thrive in this new, dynamic environment. Marcus has been doing incredible things to streamline our processes, and we need everyone to be on board for this journey." I looked from her earnest, empty face to Marcus's smug smile. He was enjoying this. The quiet humiliation, the formal documentation of my supposed incompetence. He thought he was cornering me, leaving me with no option but to either fall in line or be pushed out, discredited and voiceless. I picked up the pen they offered me. I read the document slowly, deliberately, making them wait. Then I signed my name on the bottom line. Lisa beamed, a relieved and genuine smile this time. "Excellent, I'm so glad we had this productive conversation." Marcus's smile widened into a smirk. He had one. He had his signed confession, his proof that I was the problem, not his miracle AI. As I stood up to leave, I paused. I took out my phone. "Just for my own records," I said, my voice flat and even, betraying no emotion. I held the phone over the document and, in the dead silence of the room, took a clear, high-resolution photograph of the entire page, my signature stark and clear at the bottom. The sound of the digital shutter was unnaturally loud. I didn't wait for a reaction. I just turned and walked out, the quiet click echoing behind me. In the hallway, I immediately opened my cloud app. New subfolder, HR. File name, coerced statement pip. Another piece of the puzzle. Another nail for his coffin. My anonymous tip to the EPA had, as I'd hoped, started a slow, grinding process somewhere deep in the federal bureaucracy. I received a cryptic, personal email from my friend a week later. Heard some interesting chatter about seismic modeling on the West Coast. People are starting to ask questions. It was enough. The seeds of external scrutiny had been planted. Now, I needed the internal catalyst, the one big, undeniably criminal act that would force an internal implosion. It arrived, as predicted, under the glorious banner of the Port Sovereign Project. A $500 million contract to design and build a state-of-the-art deep water port for a European shipping conglomerate. The deal was Marcus's baby, his crown jewel, the project that would cement his legacy at the company. But the European Union's environmental regulations were ironclad, far stricter than our domestic standards. They required a comprehensive marine biodiversity impact assessment, a detailed catalog of every species in the proposed construction zone, from phytoplankton to migratory whales, and a robust plan to mitigate any negative impact. It was a monumental undertaking, requiring months, if not a full year, of careful, on-site data collection through all 4 seasons. Marcus, however, in his infinite wisdom, had promised the clients a final, approved report in 6 weeks. It was an impossible, laughable timeline. I watched from the sidelines as he pushed the marine biology team, a small, underfunded department, to their breaking point. I was BCC'd on the frantic emails, the weekend work requests. I also saw the glaring gaps in the data they were collecting. The seasonal migration patterns of a protected species of sea turtle couldn't be observed in a 6-week window in late autumn. The deep water coral reef surveys required specialized submersibles that were booked months in advance. The project was doomed to fail on its scientific merits. I knew Marcus wouldn't let that happen. He wouldn't admit failure. He would cheat. The only question was how. I found my answer in the company's digital archives. I spent an entire weekend of my own time digging through the servers, searching for a past project with a similar ecological profile. I found it in the archived records of a project from 5 years ago, a proposed offshore oil rig near a marine sanctuary off the coast of Australia. The project was ultimately cancelled due to political pressure, but not before a full, multi-season biodiversity assessment had been completed at enormous expense. The report was a work of art, hundreds of pages of beautiful, detailed, and utterly irrelevant data. My theory was simple and horrifying. Marcus was going to steal the old data, swap the title pages and GPS coordinates, and pass it off as the new data from Port Sovereign. It was a gamble of such epic, breathtaking arrogance that it was almost brilliant. If he was caught, it wouldn't just be a breach of contract. It would be international wire fraud, a serious federal crime that carried a prison sentence. I set up a digital tripwire. I wrote a simple script, a few lines of code that would monitor the Australian projects folder on the server and send an alert to a burner email account if the files were ever accessed or copied. For 2 weeks, there was nothing. Then, on a Tuesday night at 1:12 a.m., my phone buzzed with a new email. Subject, alert. The body of the email was a single line of text, file access initiated. I had him. I logged in remotely from my home laptop, using a secure connection that left no trace. I watched, my heart pounding, as the entire folder, gigabytes of data, was copied. I tracked the destination. A temporary, unlabeled folder on Marcus's personal network drive. He was sloppy. He was arrogant. He was mine, but I needed more than just proof he'd copied it. I needed proof that he had used it. I waited. The final Port Sovereign report was submitted to the clients 2 weeks later. Marcus held a celebratory meeting for the executive team, praising the Herculean effort and innovative data synthesis that had allowed them to achieve the impossible. He was triumphant. He had his victory. That night, I went to war. I couldn't risk using any of the company's networked printers or scanners, which I knew logged every action. I went down to the basement, to the old, forgotten records room that smelled of dust and decaying paper. In the corner, covered in a grimy tarp, was an old flatbed scanner, a relic from a decade ago. It wasn't connected to the network. It saved directly to a USB drive. It was a ghost. It was perfect. I had already retrieved the official, printed and bound copy of the Australian Biodiversity Report from the deep archives, and I had downloaded the new Port Sovereign report Marcus had just so proudly submitted. I spent the next 4 hours in that cold, silent basement, meticulously scanning pages from each report, side by side. The evidence was even more damning than I had imagined. Page 27 of the Australian report, a detailed sonar map of a coral reef, was identical to page 31 of the Port Sovereign report, right down to a unique, branching coral formation shaped like a human hand. The only difference was the title block and the GPS coordinates, which had been crudely altered in a different font. I found dozens of examples. Plankton density charts, Sea turtle migration maps with identical satellite tracking paths. Dolphin acoustic recordings that were waveform identical. All lifted directly from the old report, a digital cut and paste job of staggering audacity. He hadn't even been particularly careful, assuming in his hubris that no one would ever have the two obscure documents side by side. He had underestimated me. I saved every comparison, every damning screenshot, to a single, heavily encrypted USB drive. The Nightingale dossier was now complete. It contained everything: the manipulated data from the Nightingale project, the falsified soil reports for the Redwood Bridge, the coerced HR complaint, and now the irrefutable evidence of his international fraud on the Port Sovereign project. It was a detailed, time-stamped, and undeniable account of a man who was willing to risk public safety, professional integrity, and the full force of the law, all for the sake of profit and ego. Now, all I needed was the stage. And I knew exactly how to build it and force him onto it. I went home and opened my personal laptop. The screen's glow pushed back against the darkness of my apartment. I began to type. It was not a plea, not an angry accusation, not an emotional screed. It was a resignation letter, and it was the most carefully constructed, lethally precise document of my entire career. It was 3 pages long, written in the cold, dispassionate, factual language of a scientific abstract. There was no emotion, only data. Dates, project numbers, specific regulatory codes, and footnotes. I began by stating my official resignation, effective in 2 weeks as per company policy. Then, I detailed the core reasons for my departure, framing them not as personal grievances, but as unresolved professional and ethical concerns that left me no choice but to depart. Each concern was a chapter in the story of Marcus's corruption. I listed the Nightingale project first, citing the unexplained and unverified manual alteration of hydraulic conductivity data within the geosynth modeling parameters, creating a significant and unreported risk to local groundwater supplies that is inconsistent with both state regulations and TerraCorp's stated public safety commitments. Next, I listed the Redwood Bridge project, citing the systematic rejection of validated, on-site geotechnical data and the forced reliance on non-site-specific regional averages, in potential violation of state seismic safety codes and established engineering best practices. Finally, I came to the Port Sovereign project. I didn't directly accuse him of fraud in a way that could be dismissed as a hysterical claim. I did something much more effective, much more insidious. I stated that a preliminary review of the biodiversity report, recently submitted to our European clients, has revealed significant and inexplicable statistical and graphical similarities to archived data from a 2018 Australian marine survey, raising material concerns about data integrity and potential non-compliance with the stringent reporting standards required by international maritime law. The final paragraph was the kill shot, the legal checkmate. It was the paragraph I had spent days refining with my lawyer. I wrote, "Pursuant to my professional obligations as a licensed geologist and as a matter of civic duty, and in accordance with the whistleblower provisions of the False Claims Act, 31 U.S.C. Section 3729, 3733, I have preserved a comprehensive, documented, and unaltered record of these and other compliance failures. This record will be made available for review by any relevant regulatory or legal authorities as may be required by law." With that single sentence, I had transformed my resignation letter into a legally binding notice of a whistleblower complaint. I had created a legal obligation for the company to investigate my claims thoroughly and transparently. Burying it was no longer an option. Doing so would constitute a criminal conspiracy. The letter was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a ticking time bomb placed directly on the CEO's desk. I saved the file as a PDF. I uploaded it to 3 separate secure cloud services, each with a different password. I emailed a final copy to my personal attorney with the subject line, "Hold until instructed. Execute trust upon my death or disappearance." It was dramatic, but I wasn't taking any chances. Then, I opened a new, clean email. To Lisa, head of HR. CC, Julian Caldwell, CEO, David Chen, head of internal audit, Margaret, head of legal. BCC, A. Sharma, personal@email.com. The BCC to myself was crucial. It would create an undeniable third-party time-stamped record of exactly who received the letter and precisely when they received it. There would be no plausible deniability. Subject: Resignation, Dr. Anya Sharma. I attached the document. My finger hovered over the send button. I took one last, deep breath. This was the point of no return. I looked at the clock on my laptop. 5:00 a.m., Monday morning. The bomb would be waiting in their inboxes when they arrived, the first thing to ruin their day, their week, their year. I clicked send. Then I took out the encrypted USB drive, the small black rectangle that held all the evidence. I slipped it into a hidden pocket inside my work handbag. I would be taking that to the office with me. It was my testimony. It was my leverage. And court, I knew, would soon be in session. The silence that Monday morning was a living thing. It filled the hallways, seeped under office doors, and hung in the air like a high-pressure system before a hurricane. I arrived at my usual time, 7:30 a.m., got my coffee from the machine, and sat down at my desk. I responded to a few routine emails. I reviewed a hydrology report from a minor project in Arizona. I acted as if it were the most normal day of my life. Around me, the usual morning buzz of the executive floor was absent. There were no cheerful greetings, no casual chats in the corridors. There were only hushed whispers and furtive glances in my direction. They knew. At 9:15 a.m., the first tremor hit. Julian Caldwell, the CEO, strode past my lab. He was a man who normally walked with an easy, confident gait. This morning, he moved like a shark, fast and silent, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at me, but I felt his awareness of me like a physical force. A minute later, Marcus Thorne walked the same path. His usual peacock strut was gone. He looked pale, his expensive suit suddenly seeming too big for him. He shot a venomous glare in my direction, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He knew who had fired the shot, but he still had no idea how much ammunition I was carrying. The summons came at 10:00 a.m. sharp via a curt, formal email from the CEO's executive assistant. Please come to the main boardroom immediately. Not would you mind, or when you have a moment. Immediately. I stood up, smoothed down my blazer, and picked up my handbag, the weight of the USB drive and inner pocket a small, solid point of reassurance. I walked to the boardroom. The journey felt 100 miles long. Every head in the open plan office turned to watch me. I was a dead woman walking, or an executioner. They weren't sure which. The room was already full. It wasn't a meeting, it was a tribunal. Julian Caldwell sat at the head of the table, his posture as rigid as steel. To his left were Margaret from Legal and David Chen from Internal Audit, their faces grim and unreadable. To his right sat a pale, sweating Lisa from HR. And directly across from the CEO's chair, in the seat reserved for the accused, was Marcus Thorne. He stared at me as I entered, his eyes burning with a desperate, cornered animal rage. A single, empty chair had been placed at the opposite end of the table, facing them all. My chair. I walked to my seat and sat down, placing my handbag on the floor beside me. I met Julian's gaze and held it, letting the silence stretch. Anya, Julian finally began, his voice dangerously low, stripped of all its usual corporate warmth. We have all read your letter of resignation. I assumed you had, I replied, my voice perfectly steady. It contains some extraordinary allegations, he continued, his eyes boring into me. Marcus couldn't contain himself any longer. He burst out, his voice cracking. They're not allegations, Julian, they're fantasies. This is nothing but professional jealousy from someone who couldn't adapt to a more efficient, profitable system. Be quiet, Marcus, Julian snapped, without taking his eyes off me. The command was so sharp, so brutal that Marcus physically flinched and fell silent, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. The power dynamic in the room had already shifted dramatically. Julian turned his attention to Lisa from HR. Lisa, as per standard procedure when an employee resigns citing such grievances, I want you to read the letter aloud. For the record. This was it. The moment I had engineered. This wasn't just an HR complaint to be handled behind closed doors anymore. It was a public testimony, entered into the official record. Lisa, looking deeply uncomfortable, picked up a printed copy of my letter. Her voice trembled slightly as she began to read. To whom it may concern, please accept this letter as formal notification that I am resigning from my position as head of Environmental Impact Assessment. The room was utterly silent except for her voice. As she read through the first section detailing the Nightingale project and the falsified water data, I saw David from Internal Audit discreetly open his own laptop and begin typing furiously. He was already checking the server logs. Margaret from Legal was making meticulous notes on a yellow pad, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. When Lisa got to the part about the Redwood Bridge and the seismic data, Marcus tried to interrupt again. "This is insane. The system simply flagged what were obviously faulty sensors." I said, "Be quiet," Julian repeated, his voice now like ice. "Let her finish." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Then, Lisa read the final, crucial allegation about the Port Sovereign project and the duplicated Australian data. I saw Margaret's pen stop moving. She slowly, deliberately, underlined a sentence twice. David looked up from his laptop, his eyes wide with shock, and stared directly at Marcus. He had found it. Marcus was no longer just pale, he was ashen. The sweat on his forehead was visible even from across the room. The mask of supreme arrogance had crumbled, revealing the panicked, sweating fraud underneath. He knew what he had done. He just never imagined, in his wildest nightmares, that he would be held accountable for it in a room full of the company's most powerful people. As Lisa's voice faded after reading the final paragraph, the one citing the False Claims Act and my preserved record of evidence, the silence that followed was heavier and more profound than anything that had come before. It was the silence of a verdict that has just been handed down. Julian Caldwell folded his hands on the table. "David," he said, his voice flat. "Report." David Chen cleared his throat. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the damning report on his screen. "CEO Caldwell, I can confirm that the system logs for the Nightingale project show a manual parameter override on the hydraulic conductivity value, timestamped at 2:37 a.m. on October 18th. The override was executed from a user ID registered to Vice President Marcus Thorne." Marcus made a small, choking sound. David continued, his voice gaining strength and confidence. "Regarding the Port Sovereign report, a preliminary file analysis shows that several key data maps and charts in the final version submitted yesterday are, in fact, bit-for-bit identical to files located in the 2018 Australian Archive folder. That folder was accessed and copied in its entirety 2 weeks ago, at 1:12 a.m., also from VP Thorne's user ID. Checkmate." Julian Caldwell slowly turned his head and looked at Marcus. It was a look of profound, ice-cold disappointment and utter contempt. It was the look a king gives a traitor right before the order for his execution is given. "Marcus," the CEO said, his voice barely a whisper, "leave the room, wait in your office, do not speak to anyone, do not touch your computer." Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. The fight had completely gone out of him. He was a hollowed-out shell. He stood up on shaky legs, a man who had just watched his entire career, his entire life, evaporate in the space of 5 minutes. He didn't look at anyone as he walked out of the room, a ghost in a $1,000 suit. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, the atmosphere in the room changed. The trial was over. Now it was about damage control. Julian looked at me, and for the first time there was a flicker of something other than anger in his eyes. It might have been respect. Or more likely, it was fear. "Dr. Sharma," he said, his voice regaining its tone of command. "That USB drive you mentioned in your letter, the comprehensive record, I assume you have it with you." I reached into my handbag, my movements calm and deliberate. I took out the small, black drive and slid it across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of him, a tiny, insignificant-looking object containing an entire world of lies. "Everything is on there," I said. "Every email, every log, every falsified report, every original data set. It's all organized by project." Margaret from legal picked it up as if it were a live grenade. "We will need to conduct a full and immediate internal investigation." "Of course you will," I said, standing up. "My resignation stands. I will fulfill my 2-week notice period to ensure a smooth transition and to answer any questions your audit team may have. After that, I am done." Julian stood up as well, a placating gesture. "Anya, wait, let's not be hasty. What Marcus did is unforgivable, but you are a valuable, integral part of this company. We need you now more than ever. We can discuss a new role, a promotion, head of a new oversight committee, a significant bonus for your integrity." It was the offer I knew would come. The attempt to buy my silence and my cooperation, to bring me back into the fold and help them clean up the mess. But it was too late. The trust was gone, the entire culture had been poisoned, and I had no interest in being the antidote. "Thank you, Julian, but my decision is final," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "My only concern now is ensuring the company does the right thing, not just for its shareholders, but for the people in those communities whose safety you are supposed to be protecting." I looked at the faces around the table. They weren't my colleagues anymore. They were the cleanup crew. I had lit the fire, and now it was their job to try and salvage what they could from the wreckage. I turned and walked toward the door, my footsteps the only sound in the room. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had won. The truth had won. Marcus Thorne's career was over. His downfall was absolute, and I had been the architect of every single step. The 2 weeks of my notice period were the most surreal of my professional life. I existed in a strange quantum state, simultaneously a pariah and a prophet. The executive floor treated me with a new, fearful reverence. Whispers ceased when I walked down the hall. People who once dismissed my concerns now looked at me with a mixture of awe and terror. I was no longer just Anya Sharma, the head of a science department. I was the ghost in their machine, the woman who had single-handedly decapitated the company's golden boy and thrown their billion-dollar enterprise into a tailspin of existential crisis. My office, once a hub of scientific collaboration, became a quiet island in a churning sea of corporate panic. I had become the company's conscience, and they didn't know whether to thank me or to burn me at the stake. Behind the scenes, the storm I had unleashed was raging with hurricane force. A team of external forensic accountants and white shoe lawyers from a firm in Washington, D.C. descended on the 40th floor. They commandeered the main boardroom, my former battlefield, and turned it into a hermetically sealed command center. The air up there grew thick with the smell of paper, fear, and billable hours. They took my USB drive, the Nightingale dossier, and began the painstaking, methodical work of verifying every claim, every piece of data, every timestamp. They were building an independent, unassailable timeline of the fraud. My days were spent in long, grueling meetings, not with my colleagues, but with these cold-eyed strangers. I sat with them and the shell-shocked remnants of our internal audit team, walking them through the evidence. I became a translator of my own revenge. I explained the scientific principles Marcus had so casually violated, showing them how changing a single digit in a hydraulic conductivity model could condemn an entire town. I showed them the statistical tricks used to erase air pollution spikes, and the metadata that proved the fraudulent biodiversity report had been copied, not created. I was methodical, professional, and detached, giving them nothing but the cold, hard facts. It wasn't personal. It was science. The results of my meticulously planned retaliation became clear in stages, each one a seismic shockwave that rocked the foundations of the company that had so profoundly betrayed my trust. The first outcome was the immediate and indefinite suspension of the Geosynth AI platform. It was unceremoniously unplugged, its sleek interface replaced by an error message. David from internal audit, now emboldened and vindicated, presented his initial findings to an emergency meeting of the board of directors. In the 6 months since its implementation, he reported, the AI had been used to materially alter or fundamentally misrepresent environmental data on 17 different active projects. 17. The room, I was told, went completely silent. The potential legal and financial exposure wasn't just significant, it was catastrophic. Each one of those 17 projects was a potential lawsuit, a potential regulatory fine, a potential headline. Next came the project fallout, a cascade of expensive and humiliating reversals. Work was immediately halted at the Redwood Bridge site, the bulldozers falling silent. The company was forced to bring in a rival, independent engineering firm to conduct a full, top-to-bottom geotechnical review, a process that would take months and cost millions in contractual delay penalties. It was a public admission of incompetence. The Pine Crest development was frozen, sales agents ordered to stop taking deposits, as an emergency air and soil remediation plan was drafted. The news leaked to a local blog, and suddenly TerraCorp was facing a firestorm of anger from the very families it had claimed to be building a community for. And the Nightingale project, the genesis of it all, was withdrawn completely and permanently. The company issued a terse, 2-sentence public statement citing the discovery of new geological information that had rendered the site unsuitable for development. It was a quiet, face-saving lie, but everyone in the industry knew what it really meant. It was an admission of defeat. The biggest consequence, the one that made the national news, was the implosion of the Port Sovereign deal. The European conglomerate, upon being officially notified by TerraCorp's lawyers of significant data irregularities in the biodiversity report, immediately and publicly terminated the $500 million contract. Their own legal team launched an international fraud investigation, and the news sent TerraCorp's stock price into a terrifying nosedive, wiping out over $1 billion in shareholder value in a single day. The financial cost of Marcus Thorne's hubris was now being counted not in millions, but in the 10-figure range. As for Marcus himself, his fate was swift and brutal. After being suspended for the first 24 hours of the investigation, he was unceremoniously fired for cause. It was a calculated legal move, one that allowed the company to invalidate his executive contract and, more importantly, invoke the fraud clause to claw back his last 2 years of multi-million-dollar bonuses. I heard through the office grapevine that he hadn't been allowed to return to his office. Security had packed his personal effects into a cardboard box, and he had been escorted from the building through a side entrance, a broken man who had gone from the king of the world to a corporate pariah in less than a week. But his humiliation was only just beginning. TerraCorp, in a desperate move to demonstrate its commitment to corporate governance to a circling flock of regulators from the SEC and the EPA, announced that it was fully cooperating with federal authorities. They had handed over my entire dossier and all the corroborating evidence their own investigation had uncovered to the Department of Justice. My quiet, personal act of defiance had escalated into a full-blown criminal investigation. Marcus Thorne was no longer just unemployed. He was now facing the very real possibility of a federal indictment and a prison sentence. On my last Wednesday at the company, Julian Caldwell called me to his office. The arrogance and dismissiveness were gone. He looked tired, smaller, as if the weight of the crisis was physically compressing him. "Anya," he said, gesturing to the plush leather chair opposite his desk, "the board has approved a special discretionary bonus for you for extraordinary services to the company and to public safety. It's a significant number." He slid a heavy, linen paper folder across the vast expanse of his desk. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. "Julian, I appreciate the gesture, but I can't accept it," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I didn't do this for a reward. I did it because it was my job. It was the right thing to do. Accepting money for it now would feel like it was transactional, and it wasn't." He looked genuinely surprised, then he nodded slowly, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his weary eyes. "I understand. I also want to, once again, ask you to reconsider your resignation." "I am personally asking you to stay. The board agrees. I want you to lead a new, independent corporate integrity division reporting directly to me and to the board. You can write your own ticket, name your own terms, your own budget, your own team." It was the ultimate validation. The offer of total, unchecked power to fix the very system I had exposed. A year ago, I might have jumped at the chance. But now, I knew better. The rot was too deep. "The trust is broken, Julian," I said, not unkindly. "For me and for the company, you don't need me to fix this. You need to build a new culture from the ground up, a culture where a person like me is listened to in the first place, not a person like Marcus. And that's a job for you and the board, not for me. My work here is done." I stood up, signaling the finality of my decision. My last day was quiet. A few members of my old team, including a grateful and vindicated Leo Petrocelli, took me out for a simple lunch at a small sandwich shop far from the office. They didn't say much about the scandal, but they didn't have to. The easy camaraderie, the shared laughter, the deep respect in their eyes was enough. When I returned to the office to pack the last of my personal belongings, there was a small, plain envelope on my otherwise empty desk. Inside was a handwritten note on the CEO's personal, embossed stationery. "Thank you, Anya," it read. "You saved us from ourselves, more than you know. Good luck." Tucked inside the note was a newspaper clipping from that morning's financial section. The headline was stark. "In wake of scandal, TerraCorp CEO announces sweeping reforms, establishes independent ethics and science oversight board." I smiled. A real, genuine smile, the first in months. That was my bonus. That was the victory. My departure, my act of calculated revenge, had forced them to create the very system I had begged for all along. The true healing wasn't for me to stay and manage their redemption. The true healing was creating a permanent system where my successor would never have to go through what I did. I left the newspaper clipping on the desk for the cleaning crew to find. I packed my box with a few textbooks, a framed photo from a geological dig in Peru, and my favorite coffee mug. On my way out, I handed my ID badge, my parking pass, and my keys to the security guard at the front desk. He nodded at me, a silent gesture of respect. As I walked out of the revolving glass doors of the steel and glass tower for the last time, I did not look back. I stepped out into the bright, chilly afternoon sun, took a deep breath of the city air, and felt a profound, exhilarating sense of lightness, as if a massive weight had been lifted from my soul. A chapter was over. A war had been won, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, completely free. The first week of my new life was defined by silence. A profound, echoing quiet that settled into the corners of my apartment, a space that had, for a decade, been little more than a place to sleep between grueling workdays. I woke up on the first Tuesday without the jolt of a 5 a.m. alarm. There was no pre-dawn rush to check emails from European offices, no frantic scan of project dashboards for overnight emergencies. I made coffee and drank it sitting by the window, watching the city come to life, a spectator for the first time instead of a participant in its relentless churn. The silence was unnerving at first. It felt like a void, the phantom limb of a crushing responsibility that was suddenly, miraculously, gone. For 10 years, my brain had been a high-performance engine running at redline, processing thousands of data points, managing deadlines, fighting political battles in boardrooms. Now, that engine was off, and in the quiet, I could finally hear the cost of the war I had won. I was exhausted. Not just tired from a few late nights, but a deep, bone-deep weariness, the cumulative fatigue of a decade spent on high alert. I spent the next few weeks trying to deprogram myself. I went for long walks with no destination. I read novels, losing myself in worlds that had nothing to do with hydrology or seismic codes. I cooked elaborate meals just for the joy of the process. But the corporate ghost still haunted me. I'd catch myself mentally drafting a rebuttal to an argument no one was making, or feel a phantom buzz in my pocket, an alert from a system I no longer had access to. I had cut the head off the snake, but its venom was still in my system. I hadn't just fought against Marcus Thorne, I had fought against a culture, a mindset, a way of seeing the world that reduced nature to a line item on a budget and human lives to an acceptable level of risk. To truly heal, I realized I couldn't just leave the building. I had to leave the battlefield entirely. So I packed a bag, threw some camping gear in the back of my old SUV, and I drove west. No plan, no itinerary. Just a full tank of gas and a desire to see the raw data of the Earth itself, unfiltered by corporate objectives. I drove through the vast, open plains of the Midwest, the landscape slowly transforming from neat squares of agriculture to the rugged, chaotic beauty of the high desert. I found myself in Utah, surrounded by the silent, towering sentinels of red rock, canyons carved by millions of years of patient, relentless work by wind and water. This was my church. Here, the truth was written in the strata of the cliffs, a history of the world that could not be manipulated or reframed. I spent my days hiking, tracing fault lines with my fingers, reading the stories in the stones. I camped under a blanket of stars so thick and bright it felt like I could reach out and touch the fabric of the universe. The scale of it all was a powerful medicine. My corporate battles, the betrayals, the lies, they all seemed so small, so petty, so insignificant against the backdrop of geological time. The knot of ice that had been lodged in my chest for months began, finally, to melt. I was in a small diner off a dusty highway in Colorado, nursing a cup of coffee and studying a topographical map, when my old life finally caught up with me. My phone, which had been blissfully silent for weeks, buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize, but the Washington, D.C. area code was unmistakable. It was my lawyer, Sarah. "Anya, I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, her voice crisp and professional, "but I have significant news." "I'm fine, Sarah. What's going on?" "The Department of Justice just unsealed the indictment against Marcus Thorne," she said. My hand tightened on my coffee cup. "It's extensive. 14 counts. Wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, multiple violations of the Clean Water Act, and most seriously, making false statements to federal regulators. Your dossier, Anya, they called it the Rosetta Stone. It gave them the key to everything. They even got his project manager on the Redwood Bridge project to flip, gave him immunity in exchange for his testimony against Marcus." I closed my eyes, a slow, deep satisfaction washing over me. It wasn't glee. It was the quiet, profound relief of a final, confirmed victory. The system had worked, the truth had held. "And Anya," Sarah continued, her voice shifting slightly, "there's more. The SEC has concluded its own investigation into TerraCorp based on the port's sovereign fraud. They've levied one of the largest corporate fines in the last 5 years, $250 million for misleading investors and regulatory bodies." "Good," I said, my voice a little hoarse. They deserved it. They do, Sarah agreed. But this is where it affects you directly. As you know, we filed the official whistleblower claim with the SEC on your behalf when you resigned. Because your information, your dossier, was the original source that led directly to this successful enforcement action and the recovery of such a significant monetary sanction, you are entitled to a percentage of that fine. The commission just made its final determination this morning. She paused. I could hear her shuffling papers. Anya, are you sitting down? Yes, Sarah, just tell me. The SEC's Office of the Whistleblower has awarded you 15% of the total fine. After taxes and fees, your net award will be approximately $28 million. The number hung in the air, so vast and abstract it felt like a joke. I said nothing. The clatter of plates in the diner, the low murmur of conversations, it all faded into a distant hum. $28 million. It wasn't a bonus. It wasn't a reward from the company. It was a finder's fee paid by the United States government for handing them the head of a criminal. It was the byproduct of my revenge, the financial ghost of Marcus's lies. Anya, are you still there? I'm here, I whispered. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, she said gently. The funds will be placed in escrow. We have time to figure out the logistics. Just congratulations, I think. I hung up the phone and stared out the window at the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Rockies. $28 million. For a moment, I felt sick. It felt like blood money, the spoils of a war I never wanted to fight. I had fought for truth, for scientific integrity, for the safety of people I would never meet. I had never, not for a single second, thought about the money. To be rewarded on this scale felt like it tainted the purity of my motives. I paid for my coffee and walked out into the cold, clean mountain air, my mind reeling. What on earth was I supposed to do with that? Buy a yacht? A private island? The very idea was absurd. It was the kind of wealth that broke people, that poisoned them from the inside out, just as Marcus had been poisoned by his relentless pursuit of it. I drove to a scenic overlook, a place where the entire valley spread out below me, a patchwork of forests and meadows. I sat on the hood of my car as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. And as I watched the day die, an idea began to form. It wasn't blood money. It wasn't a lottery win. It was a weapon. It was the most powerful tool for change that I had ever been given. The fight against Marcus Thorne was over, but the war against all the other Marcus Thornes of the world, the ones still sitting in boardrooms, manipulating data and cutting corners, that war was endless. And I had just been handed the budget to build an arsenal. I wouldn't be their victim. I wouldn't be their whistleblower. I would be their accountability. 6 months later, I wasn't in a corner office on the 40th floor. I was in a modest, second-floor office space above a bookstore in downtown Denver. The walls were still bare, the furniture was functional and second-hand, and the air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. On the main wall was a massive, high-resolution satellite map of the United States, dotted with dozens of colored pins. Each pin marked a major industrial project located near a vulnerable community, a sensitive ecosystem, or a critical water source. I had used a fraction of the money to create the Nightingale Foundation, a nonprofit pro bono team of scientists, lawyers, and data analysts. Our mission was simple: to be the independent, uncompromisable watchdog that I had so desperately needed. We used public data, satellite imagery, and anonymous tips to audit the environmental claims of major corporations. We provided free, expert analysis to underfunded community groups and local regulators, giving them the scientific firepower to stand up to corporate giants. We weren't just fighting fires, we were fireproofing the system. My phone rang. It was an unknown number, but the caller ID said New York. I answered. Anya, it's Julian Caldwell. His voice was a ghost from another life. He sounded humbled, tired. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, he began, but I felt I had to call. I saw the article about your new foundation. What you're doing, it's remarkable. It's necessary, Julian, I said, my voice even. I know, he sighed. We're still cleaning up the mess here. The fines, the lawsuits, the consent decree with the EPA. It will take a decade to rebuild our reputation. Marcus was sentenced last week. Did you hear? I saw the news, I said. He'd gotten 15 years in federal prison. His arrogance had held until the very end, pleading not guilty, forcing a trial that had laid bare every detail of his fraud for the world to see. He destroyed so much, Julian said quietly. But in the end, Anya, you didn't just save those communities. You saved this company. You forced us to face the truth. The new oversight board you essentially designed, it's working. It's painful, it's expensive, but it's making us better. I'm glad to hear it, Julian. I just wanted to say thank you, he said, and then, after a pause, and I'm sorry. Goodbye, Julian, I said, and ended the call. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his thanks. I had something far better. I walked over to the map on the wall. A new intern, a bright, idealistic young geologist from the local university, had just added a new pin. A proposed mining operation in Appalachia that was threatening to contaminate the headwaters of a major river. I picked up a file. I looked at the data. The fight was just beginning. My revenge on Marcus Thorne was complete, but my healing, I realized, came from transforming that personal battle into a public purpose. He had tried to silence the data. I had turned myself into its amplifier. He had tried to break me. Instead, he had forged me into a shield, not just for one company, but for anyone standing in the way of greed disguised as progress. The checkmate wasn't just winning the game. It was changing the board itself. And my new life, my true beginning, was just getting started.